Please don't feel bad for missing your partner after a couple days of being away from them. Don't let anybody make you feel like that's like a negative thing. It's not.
Disney's choice to cast Rachel Zegler as Snow White has become one of the most talked about entertainment controversies in recent years, and it hasn't even reached theaters yet. What started as a simple casting announcement quickly snowballed into a cultural flashpoint, drawing in fans, critics, and even satirical heavyweights like South Park. The situation illustrates just how sensitive audiences have become to Hollywood's remakes, reboots, and attempts at modernization, and how quickly a film can turn into a lightning rod for larger debates. From the very beginning, Zegler's casting sparked heated conversations. Snow White, as her name makes clear, was originally defined by her pale skin. White as snow. Choosing a Latina actress for the role felt to many like a deliberate attempt to reframe a classic icon. Supporters applauded the move as a step toward inclusivity, while critics argued it undermined the story's original foundation. Instead of excitement, the casting triggered months of online feuds, think pieces, and countless YouTube rants dissecting whether Disney's decision was progressive, performative, or simply reckless. But the casting was only the start. Once details about the film's reimagined plot surfaced, fans realized Disney wasn't merely modernizing around the edges, they were overhauling the entire fairy tale. The new Snow White would no longer need a prince or a romance to define her journey. Instead, she was recast as a fiercely independent leader, someone who would chart her own destiny and, according to some reports, even lead a kind of revolution. It was a bold attempt at reframing a classic story for modern sensibilities, but to many it felt like Disney was grafting a completely different character onto the Snow White name. The Seven Dwarfs were also reworked, stripped of their original depiction to avoid stereotypes, and replaced with a different concept altogether. At that point, the film looked less like a remake and more like an entirely new movie wearing Snow White's costume. Rachel Zegler herself added fuel to the fire with her interviews. Instead of playing diplomat, she leaned into the critique of the original. She called the 1937 classic outdated, problematic, even weird, and insisted this new version would correct those flaws. In a now infamous comment, she even joked about disliking apple-flavored snacks on set, a remark that struck many as dismissive of one of the most iconic elements of the story. What might have been brushed off as harmless banter turned into ammunition for critics who already doubted her respect for the role. The question began circulating: did she even like the story she was starring in? This was the context South Park stepped into, and as usual, they didn't miss their chance. Known for biting satire that goes beyond surface-level mockery, South Park's Into the Panderverse episode delivered a scathing take on Hollywood's current trends, with Disney's Snow White fiasco serving as the perfect example. The boys themselves were transformed to highlight the absurdity. Cartman became a bold female lead, Stan was recast with a new ethnicity, and even Kenny and Butters were altered beyond recognition. The humor worked on two levels. It was absurdly funny to see familiar characters so distorted, and it was uncomfortable because it hit close to home. Yet what made the episode powerful wasn't just the jokes about race-swapping or gender-bending characters. It was the direct assault on Hollywood's motives. South Park's message was clear: studios aren't truly advancing representation. They're recycling old stories, slapping on cosmetic changes, and selling it back as progress. Representation, in this framing, becomes less about authentic storytelling and more about marketing strategy. That criticism resonated far beyond the show's usual fanbase. Audiences frustrated with endless remakes and corporate virtue signaling saw the parody as saying what they'd been thinking all along. Reports soon surfaced that Disney was less than thrilled with South Park's take. Rumors circulated that the studio had quietly complained about the episode, angered by how nakedly it mocked their creative direction. The irony couldn't have been sharper: a group of foul-mouthed cartoon kids exposing billion-dollar corporate hypocrisy. In some ways, it was the perfect metaphor for the imbalance between audiences and megastudios, ordinary people, armed with satire and criticism, pushing back against Hollywood's attempts to control the narrative. Of course, South Park's battle with Disney is nothing new. Over the years, they've lampooned nearly every corner of the Mouse's empire. From Star Wars to Frozen, Mickey Mouse himself has been portrayed as a ruthless, money-grabbing overlord. But this Snow White parody felt different. It wasn't just about mocking a single movie. It tapped into a broader cultural discontent, the sense that Hollywood is stuck in a cycle of remakes, reboots, and half-hearted updates that prioritize messaging over creativity. For many, the Snow White remake became the symbol of this trend, a case study in how not to modernize a beloved story. And that's why people are still talking about it. Even before its release, the film has become bigger than itself. It represents a clash between nostalgia and modernity, between creative risk-taking and corporate safety nets, between genuine inclusivity and surface-level pandering. Whether the movie succeeds or fails at the box office, its legacy as a cultural flashpoint is already secured. South Park may have delivered the funniest critique, but the conversation isn't going away anytime soon. Amid all of this noise, Rachel Zegler suddenly finds herself caught in the middle of something far bigger than her career alone. On one side, she's a rising star, a young actress stepping into the limelight with enormous opportunities ahead of her. On the other, she has unwillingly become the face of a much larger cultural debate, a lightning rod for frustration with Disney, Hollywood, and the endless cycle of reboots. South Park didn't simply poke fun at Snow White. They went deeper, dismantling the entire model that drives the modern entertainment industry. Their Panderverse episode wasn't subtle. It painted Hollywood as an industry so obsessed with optics and diversity checkboxes that it has forgotten the foundation of compelling storytelling. The satire was sharp. Cartman became a caricature of the stereotypical strong female lead, reduced to shouting vague empowerment slogans. Stan was given a forced ethnicity swap. Kenny and Butters were no longer characters with depth, but token props. It was outrageous and funny, but also disturbingly accurate. The show wasn't just pointing at silly creative changes, it was asking a serious question. When Hollywood changes characters in the name of progress, is it really about inclusion, or is it just a slick marketing tactic dressed up as virtue? That question struck a nerve. Some praised South Park for finally saying what no one else dared to say, that recasting and repackaging existing characters isn't innovation, it's laziness. Others pushed back, calling the episode anti-woke. But the underlying critique was hard to ignore. True representation requires new worlds, new characters, and new voices. It doesn't come from filtering old fairy tales through the lens of social media trends. Meanwhile, Rachel Zegler found herself under a microscope she never asked for. Every interview clip, every awkward soundbite, every line taken out of context was dragged across the internet. Her comment calling the 1937 animation outdated and weird was replayed endlessly. The time she demanded fair streaming residuals for actors was reframed as entitlement rather than advocacy. The problem wasn't always what she said, it was how it came across. Fans who wanted to feel respect for the legacy of Snow White instead felt dismissed, as if the story they grew up loving was now being mocked. And when she joked about not liking apple-flavored snacks, even that was twisted into proof that she didn't care for the role. This is where the resentment began to grow. For die-hard Disney fans, Snow White wasn't just another film. It was history. It was the first Disney feature, a cultural milestone. Seeing it reframed as a vehicle for lectures on empowerment, stripped of its magic and charm, felt like betrayal. And then came the trailer, which only intensified the divide. The tone was darker, the magic gone, the prince erased, the dwarves reimagined. What was left was a murky plot about a stolen crown and personal empowerment, themes that might have worked in a new film but felt out of place wearing Snow White's name. To one group, this was long overdue progress, a diverse lead, a modern message, a princess story not tied to romance. To another, it felt like bait and switch. They hadn't asked for a reinvention, they had wanted the story they cherished. South Park distilled all of that frustration into comedy gold. Their parody didn't just mock Zegler or Disney, it exposed the machinery behind the decisions. It showed an industry more concerned with how things look on a press release than whether the stories themselves inspire or resonate. It argued, in its own absurd way, that what audiences were being fed wasn't art, but marketing. And disturbingly, many people nodded along. For years, Hollywood has felt less like it's creating and more like it's reacting, following algorithms, chasing hashtags, scrambling to preempt outrage rather than telling timeless stories. When South Park becomes the clearest voice of reason in the conversation, you know something is off. Disney's response, or lack thereof, spoke volumes. Officially, there were no bold statements. But behind the scenes, whispers circulated that the company had quietly reached out to South Park creators, hoping to avoid further ridicule in future episodes. If true, that's telling. It suggests the satire didn't just land, it rattled. A corporation as massive and calculated as Disney doesn't move unless it feels a real threat, and the fact that a cartoon could dent their image that much says everything. Reports even suggested executives worried that the laughter might metastasize into something worse, a loss of trust in the Disney brand itself. And honestly, they weren't wrong. For years, Disney's live-action remake machine has been running at full steam. Aladdin, Mulan, The Little Mermaid, The Lion King, and now Snow White. But each new release has tested audiences' patience a little more. The novelty has worn off. The nostalgia has dimmed. And once audiences start laughing at your formula, it's only a matter of time before they stop paying for it. That's what made South Park's satire so devastating. It didn't just get laughs. It exposed a pattern, one the audience already sensed but hadn't articulated. Endless reboots, checklist casting, press tour soundbites that sound like they were lifted straight from a PR handbook. The magic fades quickly once you realize you're being sold the same trick over and over again. And in the middle of it all is Rachel Zegler, a young actress who, whether she wanted to or not, has become the face of this cultural standoff. To some, she represents progress and change. To others, she symbolizes Hollywood's arrogance and tone deafness. But either way, she's carrying the weight of something much bigger than herself. The growing frustration with an industry that seems more interested in branding than in storytelling. For someone still standing at the early edge of her career, the opportunity that Rachel Zegler received was monumental. It wasn't just another role, it was the chance to step into a legacy, to embody a character who for nearly a century has lived in the imaginations of millions across the world. Naturally, the spotlight is harsh, and with it comes scrutiny. Some of the criticism directed toward her was unnecessarily cruel, fueled more by internet outrage than thoughtful critique. Yet, not all of it was unfair. People pay attention when it comes to heritage characters, especially those tied to the films that shaped their childhoods. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're cultural memory. And when audiences hear an actor speak more passionately about what they disliked in the original than what they loved in the remake, it strikes a nerve. Fans line up for old Disney classics for a reason, and it isn't just the hand-drawn animation, the memorable songs, or the nostalgia. It's the simplicity, the warmth, and the emotional resonance, the kind of magic that feels timeless. But that magic becomes fragile when it is replaced by layers of politics, corporate messaging, and self-aware commentary. When a fairy tale stops feeling like a story and begins to feel like a lecture, something vital is lost. South Park captured this sentiment brilliantly, not simply through jokes, but through its depiction of cultural fatigue, the sense that every piece of entertainment now carries a moral checklist. Instead of losing yourself in characters who feel alive, audiences are asked to view them as statements, symbols, or lessons. A night at the theater risks turning into a civics class disguised as a movie. The irony is that audiences do want inclusion. They want fresh voices, different perspectives, and heroes who look like the world we actually live in. But what they crave even more is sincerity. Representation that feels authentic, not manufactured to polish a studio's reputation. A story created because a writer or filmmaker was passionate about telling it, not because it scored well in a corporate focus group. That is the difference between art that resonates and content that preaches. True representation isn't about repainting an old character with a new color palette. It's about creating new stories, new worlds, and new icons. Imagine if Disney introduced an entirely original Latina princess, building her mythology from the ground up instead of rebranding a European fairy tale. That would feel bold. That would feel real. And it would allow someone like Rachel Zegler to shine not by inhabiting an old crown, but by forging one of her own. The truth, however, is that studios rarely take such risks. Remixing a proven hit is safer than gambling on an unknown. It's easier to rely on the audience's familiarity than to test their appetite for something unfamiliar. So we get another remake, another reimagining, another new coat of paint on the same old story. Yet the well they keep drawing from is beginning to dry. South Park's parody highlighted this cultural exhaustion, but the sentiment extends far beyond satire. Audiences are growing weary. They aren't fooled by corporate slogans about innovation when the product is recycling the past.
Probably my camera.
Yeah.
You know, I love to document, but it's mostly me taking pictures of my dog and sending them to you.
The next generation of viewers, especially, is unlikely to line up for stories that feel algorithmically generated. They're sharp, digitally native, and quick to scroll past anything that feels hollow. Instead, they're laughing at the memes, seeking independent creators, and searching for narratives with genuine meaning. They want to be moved, not marketed to. They want stories that dare to be stories again. And in the end, that's the risk Disney and actors like Rachel face. Not the risk of failure from one film, but the risk of losing an audience that no longer sees the magic, only the machinery.